So yeah, let me introduce Diana for a moment. I'll talk about the book. She'll talk about her connection, and then we'll have an open discussion.
My name is Diana Richards. Since we're talking about superheroes, just so you know, I did take my name Diana from Wonder Woman, absolutely. Because when I transitioned, I'm a big comic book person. When I transitioned, I knew that Clark or Bruce wouldn't work, so I left Diana. Chris and I have known each other for about 3 years, just real shortly. I retired in 2017. All my life, and we're talking about going back to where I was 10 years old in 1963. Yes, I'm that old. I had started reading and collecting comic books. Over the years, I collected about 7 or 8,000 of them. And I got tired of hauling them around, and my goal was always to donate them to a small liberal arts college for the purpose of research, academic research. Long story short, and I'll get back into this, but long story short, ended up meeting Chris and donating the comics, and they are now cataloged, curated, upstairs on the second floor. So if any of you want to do research in this area, communications, graphic design, history of art, popular culture, it's a wonderful resource. So that's how we met. How this project that we're talking about came about is kind of springboard. It came about because Chris wrote a book, and the book inspired what we're going to talk about later.
Thank you. Yeah, so like I said, I thought I would just talk for a moment about some of the ideas in the book, and the best way to do that is to just kind of like read the very first page, which introduces a lot of the ideas, and hopefully you'll find interesting. But then we can discuss this, especially in relation to what Diana's going to talk about in a moment. So if you will bear with me, this is the first page of Batman and the Joker, Contested Sexuality in Popular Culture, which just came out. Soundbites swept across social media streams as gossip spread from insider whispers to online news sources. Showcasing DC's new Black Label, Batman Damned was not an especially anticipated series, but shelves were soon stripped bare. Something swinging in the shadows seemed to boost sales for writer Brian Azzarello and Lee Bermejo's debut story. Has anyone seen that, by the way? Has anyone read Damned yet? Okay, you will after this, I'm sure. Stumbling into the Batcave, Bruce Wayne returns from near death. He slips off his cape and cowl as the Batmobile steams under the stalactites and asks his computer to scan for stab wounds. Starting from left to right, we see Wayne remove his suit to reveal chiseled abdominals and scarred pectorals. Shifting his knee, he exposes massive quadriceps, also marred from years of struggle. Surfacing unmistakably in the last panel of the strip, silhouetted in the stark shadows below the crease of his obliques, is the sharp contour of a circumcised penis. I thought about putting it up here, but then I thought that would distract from everything. So you're welcome to Google that maybe after I read this or after we have our talk. Still, it seems uncertain if the depiction was an element the artist meant to better obscure or a cheeky insertion an overworked editor failed to see. It may even have been a shrewd marketing strategy from which the company quickly sidestepped when things started to simmer. In spite of everything, Batman's manhood was there for readers to soak in for the first time in 79 years. Several late-night television hosts such as Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, and Seth Meyers joked about the revelation. Sites were saturated with sentiments and seditions. Shortly, DC announced the company had severed the appendage from digital editions, and any reprintings would feature the Ken doll version. It's something we wish never happened because it really took the attention away from what we thought was quality storytelling, said DC Entertainment co-publisher Dan Didio. That's not the way we see this imprint. Collectors purchased any and every copy they could get their hands on. The comics originally sold for $6.99 US, but soon appeared online for well over $100. Signed copies currently sell for more than $2,000. The frantic consumption of Batman's penis by countless comics fans, which some surveys suggest are as high as 93% male, reveals much about the ambiguous space of sexuality in mainstream popular culture today. While many enthusiasts likely and rightly claim this issue would be a valuable collector's item, such explanations merely beg the question, why fetishize it in the first place? In an age of online pornography, celebrity scandal, and hypersexual advertising, Wayne's exposed body seems rather chaste. His focus in Bermejo's art, like that of Michelangelo's David or Cellini's Perseus, remains on the imperative of slaying monsters. His nakedness is an afterthought. It is a necessity brought about after a surreal encounter with the Joker and uncertainty about both their fates. But the demand for this issue, and really this image, would never have surfaced without the illicit sight of Batman's sex organ. The expression breaking the internet peppered reports and comments about Damned. In a syndicated New York Post article, the author concludes, while Batman's mind may be breaking, his body is breaking the internet. Prior to this event, social media popularized the phrase breaking the internet in relation to Kim Kardashian's photo shoot with Jean-Paul Goude in Paper magazine. The winter 2014 issue featured nude images of the reality television star and a cover photograph of her in a shimmering black gown with a champagne glass resting on her backside. It ignited a barrage of news media coverage, commentary, and internet memes. In this case, the images were unmistakably sexual. Kardashian, who constructed her celebrity sex status in the early 2000s following an amateur sex video, explicitly tries to titillate. She smiles knowingly at the viewer. Her slick and exposed body doused with champagne clearly calls to be consumed by the heterosexual male gaze. And many straight men, who likely had never heard of Paper magazine, were not shy about voicing their desires for the celebrity when the photos surfaced. By contrast, Batman's image appears not to target the overt desires of heterosexual men, despite that demographic comprising the vast majority of DC's market. Instead, it breaks open certain assumptions about sexuality in popular culture and raises provocative questions about privilege practice in popular media. As Laura Mulvey's work on Hollywood cinema demonstrates, the standard for most films, and by extension popular culture more broadly, situates the female as a passive object to be consumed for male gratification. In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, looking has been split between the active male and the passive female, she writes. In a classic film such as Rear Window, for example, straight women and queer men must implicitly adopt the position of the heterosexual male spectator to understand why the camera lingers slowly over Grace Kelly's body as James Stewart drinks in her image and directs her and others to do things for him. While some conventions change, this gendered structure appears hardwired into mainstream popular culture. Even when Daniel Craig ascends the shoreline as James Bond in a revealing bathing suit in Casino Royale in 2006, echoing the appearance of Honey Ryder in the first Bond film, Dr. No, in 1962, it becomes the exception that proves the rule. The wink that says, here's one for the ladies, now back to the heteronormative show. But Bermejo's impressionistic nudes are relatively passive. There is no satisfying sense of omnipotence to connect the viewer to Batman's gaze. In fact, the composition hides his head, fragmenting Wayne's body, much like contemporary media tend to present women's forms as collections of commoditized parts. In doing so, the panels fail to neatly fit into the category of a pleasurable consumable for heterosexual male viewers. And yet we see from sales and commentary that this representation garners not less, but more lust, more desire to be consumed. The image also enters an intimate practice of comics reading, which tends to be a solitary activity experienced in the comfort of a bedroom or a private space. Alison Mandeville writes that reading comics can be especially powerful for the intimacy it offers as a recursive and dialogic form that invites continual play between words and pictures, frames and contents, events known and gutters unknown, and in independent comics, especially high culture, low culture. In Damned, the script for how to respond to and take pleasure in depictions of this nude body shatters the traditional dichotomy, creating an interesting potential for reading and thinking about a character approaching a century in age. While it often goes unremarked, perhaps even unnoticed, Damned exemplifies how an enduring hero such as Batman reveals much about the constructions, desires, and discursive practices enveloping mainstream understandings of gender and sexuality today, and not just when he undresses. In the following chapters, I seek to interrogate why something like the depiction of Batman's penis could cause consumers to snatch up copies without any explicit libidinal desires. I question how such representations reflect and contribute to understandings of masculinity in contemporary culture. More specifically, I use Batman comics and the relationship of the Caped Crusader and the Joker to unpack how gender and sexuality function in mainstream popular culture today. And that is the very beginning of this book. And what I do in the following chapters, basically, is look at how Batman/Bruce Wayne continually tries to model what he and we may think a man should be. So he's continually trying to meet expectations of the man, and yet always demonstrating in some way that he's never quite there. It's always a performance. In the next chapter, I talk about how the Joker does a similar thing in that he also is very cognizant of these norms and these performances, except he transgresses them, or else, and sometimes at the same time, he simply makes fun of people who pretend that it's normal and that there is no performance. He thinks that's really funny, but of course, it's in exposing that, he also scares people. He does more than that, but that's what I focus on. And then in the final chapter, it's a short book, I look at the spaces that they both use in order to do these things. Batman primarily in the Batcave, which can be analogous to the closet in many ways, and the Joker in his haciendas, which sometimes they call them, where it's usually in a fairground or a place outside of town, outside of the norm, where he can venture into town for a moment and play with the norms, but then go back to where things are kind of flipped and inverted and carnivalesque. And so there's lots to talk about, and I'm obviously happy to answer questions and talk more. I can always talk about Batman when you want to. But yeah, I hope that maybe provokes some ideas and questions. And then I think Diana's presentation will tie in some things and show you how we got talking and what we're talking about right now.
Thank you, Chris. Like I said, Chris and I have known each other for 3 years. This book brought about a whole new way of thinking, a whole new kind of project that we're working on. And for the purposes of this, I'm calling it Batman is Transgender, or I'm Batman. To me, it's the Michael Keaton Batman, but to Ben, it's the Christian Bale, with the gruff voice and all that. I'm Batman. What do I mean by that? Well, before I get into this, I want to say that Chris and I would really would like this to have the Q&A be more extended than most of these presentations. A lot of people talking in 5 minutes for Q&A. Be thinking about your questions because we're going to have time at the end. Also, I will be here. If anybody has any kind of individual questions about the transgender experience or the issues we're going to be talking about, I'll be in the library, up by the comic books, of course, from 1 to 5 until tomorrow. So if anybody would like to talk about any of these things, please come by. So my story starts in 1953. I was born in the 50s, the so-called bucolic 50s, and it really looked like that. At 5 years old, I was reading comic books. I wasn't reading them, of course. I was just looking at the pictures and figuring out the action. But at 5 years old, I was reading comic books. These darn masks. At 5 years old, I also knew I wanted to be a girl. If any of you are transgender or you know anybody who's transgender, you know that this is something that pretty much you're born with, and you are aware of it at a very, very early age. In 1958, until very recently, it's not something that you talked about. Never tell. Going forward, about 60 years, like I said, I collected a lot of comic books. This is just a screenshot of the catalog that's here in the library. In 2016, retired, Murphy, Carolina, beautiful home up on a mountaintop. And like I said, what happened was the internet guy was installing the internet, and he looked around my office and he saw the Batman stuff, and he said, "My son would love this." I said, "Really?" "Yeah, he goes to Young Harris College. They actually teach this stuff. There's a guy there that's sort of in charge of it." I said, "Oh, really?" Because like I said, I had always wanted to donate my collection to a college just like this. So again, go back and forth, back and forth. I donated the collection. That's as much of my face, of my old face, as you're going to see. And now brings us to the present. I transitioned in January of this year. Transitioning to me is simply on one date from the next, living full-time as Diana. Of course, I had been practicing for 50 years, but that was the day that I was fully public. In August of this year, I sent an email to Chris because I thought he's a friend, he should know what's going on. He said, "Well, of course." And then he told me that he wrote this book, and he directed me to this video. You can look at it yourself. It's a video that Chris produced to kind of talk about his book. And this video was a revelation. It was an epiphany. Because when Chris in the book talks about kind of the core argument, I think, of the book is the performative nature that we all have. Performative isn't a bad thing, but I realize, I don't know why in all those 60 years of reading comic books and being transgendered, I had never made this direct connection between the superhero tropes and being transgender until I listened to or watched Chris's video. When we perform, again, when you're with your friends, you're performing one way. When you're with a teacher, you're performing in one way. With your parents or at work or whatever, we're all performing these different true selves, which is very much the nature of the transgender as well as the superhero. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these congruences. The big one, of course, is performance of the true self. For 60 years, 65 years, I was a true self. I was a man. I mean, look at me. I'm 6.5 feet tall. I was a big guy. I was married, kids, grandkids. I had a career. I had a job, many jobs. I had my ups and downs. I had a life as my old self. But I also performing as Diana at the same time. I never had any problem believing that all Superman had to do was put on a pair of glasses to become Clark Kent, because it's not the glasses. It's the way he moves, the way he acts as Clark Kent, as opposed to Superman. I think Chris Reeve did it best. In fact, see if we can get to this. Oh, somebody help me here. Here we go. Okay. That's really not important. Just watch what happens. Watch how Superman moves. In fact, having it muted is probably better. Watch all of his body language, his facial expressions. He's performing as Superman here. He flies away. I mean, look at this. His face is full of confidence. He's Superman. He's somebody you can trust to save you. And he flies away. Watch the countdown. Chris Reeves does this in 25 seconds. It truly is remarkable. She's thinking, Superman? Clark Kent? Hmm. Now watch Clark Kent as opposed to Superman. He's performing in a completely different way. He's performing as Clark Kent. Just as the transgender, I would perform as my old self. I'm performing as Diana now. Look at what he does. It's his body language. It's everything about the performance that makes him Clark Kent, not Superman. So yeah, the glasses, it's not just the glasses. Now watch this. It's Clark Kent. Now who is he? He's not in uniform, is he? But he's Superman. And now he goes back. He thinks again. No, he's not going to do it. Oh. Okay. So the performative nature of superhero, and you can see the performative nature of being transgendered as well. Very, very powerful. The costume as a transformative device. Clark Kent, he can shoot laser beams from his eyes. He can punch through walls. Peter Parker can climb up walls. But until they put on the costume, they're not Superman. They're not Batman. They're not Spider-Man. It's the costume that gives Bruce Wayne the Batman-ness of the character. I cannot be Diana without these clothes. I have to have the costume, the uniform that makes me Diana. That's not all of it, of course. It's not just a pair of glasses. It's everything else. It's how you move. It's how you act. Everything about it. But the costume is so important to the superhero and the transgender. Here's an example. Look at his body language before. Look at the body language after. The clothes, of course, are a lot different, but that's the same person, performing as one or the other. The secret identity. Obviously, this is so critical. Now, things have changed in the last 10 years or so. People are much more open. But let me tell you, up until about, I don't know when, 15 years, 20 years ago, if you told people you were transgendered, you would lose your job, you would lose your family. It was bad times. Why does the superhero need a secret identity? Anybody? To protect their loved ones. Why does the transgender need to hide being transgendered? To protect the loved ones and to protect themselves too. Because if without a secret identity, Batman, he's a target. Without a secret identity, I was a target. The superhero, the transgender needs that secret identity. There you go. A place of sanctuary. The Batcave, the Fortress of Solitude. Why does Batman or Superman need the Batcave? Place he doesn't have to perform, or a place where he can change clothes. He can change clothes. The old Batman TV series, if any of you watch it, he goes down the pole, Bruce Wayne, bottom of the pole, Batman. It's also a place to store your good stuff. You know, your giant penny or whatever it is. The transgender needs that secret place as well. Now, I was fortunate. I had the back room of a building where I could store my stuff, where I could change, a safe place to change into become the other true self. I should say that I don't speak for the transgender community. I speak for myself, but I think it's fair to say that millions of people who are transgender have something. Maybe it's just a closet. Maybe it's just a suitcase in an attic. But they have that secret place just as Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, they all do as well. And the primacy of the visual. What makes a comic book a comic book? Art. It's the art. It's a great story, but the story does not become a comic book without the art. You can follow pretty much what's happening in this. I mean, there's a lot of action. They're in the air, Spider-Man, and there's a story, but there's a story behind there. Same with the transgender. Appearance is everything. I spend hours going every detail. I mean, I'm 6.5 feet tall. I'm 67 years old. I have to make sure that every detail is appropriate, is performing to the gender expectation. And it works. It works. I go anywhere I want to. I use the ladies' room. It just works. Appearance is everything, but it has to be underlaid or overlaid on a great story, because without a great story, it doesn't make any difference. So we have the story, we have the art, and my own personal story. Whenever there's a change in the costume, what happens on the internet? Fanboys go crazy, right? Whenever there's a movie, first question, what's the costume look like? Is it stupid or is it cool? And Superman has had all kinds of different costumes depending on the story underlying that visual, just as I do. Because the visual is so important, I just take a picture of myself before I go out to make sure that I don't look stupid. So those are just some of the issues that Chris and I are going to be exploring. We're not sure if it's going to be a book, maybe a series of chapters, maybe YouTube, but I'm keep walking out of the picture. When I started realizing that there are these congruencies, these confluences, it's a really, really exciting, and when we think a new idea. So we're going to be exploring that. Like I said, please, I hope you've been thinking of questions. I hope you have questions for Chris or myself. And also remember that, got that backwards. I'll be upstairs from 1 to 5 tomorrow, and now it's your turn. Yeah.
Could this logic be used to imply that any superhero we encounter could be transgender? I'm so sorry. Logic be used to imply that every superhero we encounter, new and old, could be transgender?
Yeah, well, I'll just say my take. I don't think one of the things I argue in my book, is that Batman isn't gay or straight. He's just definitely queer, though. He's queer in the sense that you can read him in different ways, and that they can perhaps be valid, but they're not locked in, right? Because after all, he doesn't exist, right? So because he doesn't exist, he can be both gay and straight in different versions, and that's why I like the idea of queer as a more open concept. But so I would say that there is a space for all heroes to be transgendered in your reading, and maybe in some representations, and that wouldn't necessarily be a wrong reading or a conversion of like the truth into your idea, but it also wouldn't be the only reading. And that's sort of how I read Batman, is like, yes, you can read him as a gay icon, but you can also read him as a sort of model of hegemonic masculinity that's almost the complete opposite. And they could both be valid because of that gutter, that space between the images, the thing that you fill in. That's another reason why comics are special, because you have to put in work in between the images and in between the words. And so in between those spaces, I'd say there's a possibility for all to be transgender, but that's not to say that they are all transgender. That's my thought.
It depends. The subtitle, or the title of Chris's book, is Batman and the Joker. The Joker has no secret identity. The Joker is wild, crazy, but he is just who he is. He's never pretending, which begs the question, when I stopped having a secret identity in January of 2020, did I become the Joker? I mean, I hope not. But when Tony Stark revealed to the world that he's Iron Man, did he stop being, in this reading, a transgender type person, or is he now one? I don't think so, because Tony Stark is an Iron Man until he puts on the armor. Who are some other characters that are just who they are? I'm sorry? Well, Thor started out as Don Blake, remember? Right. But he is just Thor now. He's no other person. So it kind of depends. Black Panther, but he has a mask, right? So when he's T'Challa, is he Black Panther? I don't think so. Everybody knows he when he puts on the suit, he's Black Panther. He can do all the stuff that Black Panther can do, but until he puts on the suit, he's not Black Panther. That's my argument. Yeah.
Having those gaps for us to fill in and interpret how we want. Do you guys think that a lot of these messages are things that only comic books can convey?
I'd say that. Are comics the only way of conveying this kind of information, or comics? In what ways are comics special for giving this kind of information? I would say that, yeah, they are special and they are unique. It's not to say that you can't do these kinds of what could loosely be called like queer readings through different media, but with film there are different conventions and different expectations and different techniques. With literature and all of these things, comic books are special because they're sequential art that you rely on words and images, right? And so there's no real other medium that does all of that the way that comics do. And because of that, yeah, there's this space. Like, so you can read a book, but everything in the book has to kind of tell you through the words. And yes, there can be subtext, but you're reading things, right? Where if you're watching a film, it's either on the screen or it's not on the screen. Although Teresa de Lauretis has this idea of the elsewhere, or like the off screen. And so in a lot of films, right, you can get a sense of what's outside of the frame based on what's going on in the frame. But comics have to do that always. Like there's always this gap from one image to the next and word to the next. And that's such a queer space, right? Because the rules, there are rules. We kind of understand how certain rules work, but we also understand that nothing is fixed in those spaces, right? They're open spaces because they're at least one step removed from a definition, like you must do this or you must do that between the two spaces. And that makes comics really special, I think. That there's a moment between when Batman enters wherever, right, and the next slide or the next image or panel, that you have to figure out what happened between there. And I think that's where comics are most interesting. So yeah, it's not like you can't do these with other media, but comics do present a very special mode of representation.
Adding to what Chris said, which I agree with, the image that I showed of that Spider-Man, that was from 2016, 18, something like that. If you go up and, of course, you have to check them out, but if you go up and read the comics, and this is interesting, the ones that are from the 60s, in fact, I have another slide deck that kind of shows this progression. If you look at them, the panels are very rigid. There's a lot of narration, little captions above and below, a lot of dialogue. So there's a lot more exposition to where you don't have to fill in so much, I don't think. And you can see this through the 60s. In the 70s, the panels start to break out a little bit, very much less dialogue. By the 80s, we're all over the place. And then by the 2000s, that image, if you'll remember, very, very little dialogue. A whole lot of, you have to like Chris says, I'm sorry, you have to fill in the blanks a little, but not as much. So I don't really know what the answer is to your question. I invite research through the collection, and you can see, I don't know what the answer is, but you can definitely see a progression in storytelling from the 60s to the 70s, 80s, and the present.
follow up on that. There is definitely, if you watch any I like watching, not often, but when I look at trailers for older films, they say everything, right? Like, this hero is about to save the day and he has found his damsel in distress, and like all of these things that are very obvious if you just watch the images, right? But, and that's not to say that earlier audiences were naive or unable to understand things, but it's now to the point in comics, film, and other places where so much goes without saying, and that is kind of liberating in a way because it leaves open more room for interpretation. Because if I said this hero is the perfect man for the job or whatever, right, you're kind of fixing it, or the narrator tries to fix it. But if you just show somebody walking into a room perhaps looking heroic, you can interpret more about that, and it leaves more options. And comics have always done that. They do some more, I think, yeah, with less exposition. But yeah, that's one of the sort of special things that comics can do.
I just want to add one more thing here. It is very difficult for me to read comics right now, current comics, because remember, I was reading them in very impressionable years in the 50s and 60s when there was a lot of dialogue. There was a lot of exposition. Current comic books, it's very difficult for me to fill in those blanks. What does that mean? It's an area of research. I don't know. But there's a generational, like you're talking about, there's very much a generational, I think, answer to your question. Yeah.
Is there like a ideological paradox with like the time and like how the comic books are changing and how the characters are changing? Like the ideology of the culture is also changing. So is there like some kind of, I guess,
No, that's a good start. Yeah. So I appreciate that. Is there a difference in the, so there is clearly a difference, although it's connected, ideologies from past to present. And what is the question exactly? So
because the ideology of the masses is changing and the
yeah.
forms of the comic books are changing and becoming more open. Do you think it's because like the way, let's say, Americans think is shifting to be more open and free and
Yeah.
free thinking, or do you think it's like easier for them to just leave things out so they don't have to?
Yeah. So yeah. So Molly is asking if there is a similarity or difference between the ideological shifts in our culture and the representations in comics and how they are represented, or how they represent ideas and ideologies, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, for starters, you wouldn't get to see a penis in 1939. I don't think Batman would have stayed long. Yeah, although there's other things, and that's one of the things. Like in the book, I have images and examples, but like Batman and Robin are often like the gay couple in that, and people will look at them and question their sexuality, which is one of the reasons I wanted to go. Actually, Bella's asked a question too about why I chose Batman and the Joker online, and I can kind of get to both of them maybe. So thank you for that online. If anyone wants to put more stuff online question-wise, I will be looking at those. But yeah, why choose Batman and the Joker, and what does it have to do with ideology, ideological representation, and change over time? You had, yeah, Batman and Robin, or Bruce and Dick, like sunbathing virtually nude together and just having a good old time. And you had, I got Jake Bennett, who's a great artist, who was working at the art gallery here to do a painting for me of his interpretation of Bruce and Dick, which if you haven't seen it, is really cool. It's online. But all of these ways of representing things today, if they did that, we would be like, oh yeah, they're definitely gay. Like this is a gay couple. But at the time, it was just so far off the radar that nobody saw it. Whereas if you had something explicit, like, yeah, full nudity or something, people would see that and respond in a much more negative way back then, I think. There's an interesting thing I mentioned in the book where Grant Morrison, so let me start with Frederick Wortham was a psychiatrist who basically vilified, you know this, but Frederick Wortham vilified a lot of people, a lot in the comics industry for ruining kids, right? And one of his criticisms was that Batman and Robin are a homosexual's dream and they're going to make kids gay, basically, which was a very bad thing in the 50s, right? I think now if you said that, you wouldn't necessarily, well, now you don't get that same kind of reaction. You might from a certain group of people, but so Grant Morrison did a more recent run of Batman a little while ago and made arguments that Batman was gay, and nobody really responded to it. In fact, there's a heading, something that's something like, Morrison says Batman is gay in interview. nobody cares, or people shrug, like fans shrug, like it wasn't a big deal. Whereas if Bob Kane had said in 1945, yeah, he's definitely gay, I wanted him to be a gay icon, we probably wouldn't have Batman today. And so definitely you can see reflected in the comics, and not just Batman, of course, but other ones as well, changes in reflecting the contemporary ideological space that we're in, right? And so I argue that you can kind of push changes in some ways, like you can push ideas out through the comics if they're popular and introduce ideas, but you're also always reflecting ideas too. I think, yeah, in terms of, you also asked like whether you need to be more specific or detailed, or whether we leave those things out now. And I think the more specific you are, the less room for those kind of alternative or open readings, and then the more boring it would be. Like if Batman just officially said, I am gay, that would be a lot less interesting, I think, over the long run, than if you don't know, right? Or if there's space to say, yeah, look at what he does here, versus the next episode or next image, you're like, oh, but maybe not, because there's this. It's much more intriguing. And I think media producers know that now, and that's part of the contemporary ideology, is you don't just say, this is our straight hero and he's walking into a great straight party, right? Like, you might have to explain things to early audiences much more so. Now you can do it where there's purposeful layers, where it's like, oh, that might hint at this, but then there's also this, and so it becomes complex. And that's, I think, what appeals to a lot of readers and viewers of films and others. You want to follow up? Yeah, but so again, if you're listening online, wouldn't one stereotype and then perhaps the opposite stereotype, so a very macho man and then a very not so macho man stereotype in the same comic, would confuse readers and wouldn't be necessarily logical or make sense to people. You saw earlier all the Superman outfits, right? And you could do this for Batman and other people. There's sort of essential qualities for Batman. It's sort of darkness. We could get into the details, but like sort of darkness, the tragedy of his parents, the solitary Batcave stuff, right? Like those qualities make Batman. But Batman is actually very sort of feminine and early. Bruce Wayne is very, what we would call today, feminine. Like, you know, just sitting back with Dick in his mansion with flowers and vases around him, and his smoking jacket and all of this, right? So that's one version, but other versions have him as like hugely buff and just like walking around as if like he could stop bullets himself, you know? And those are both versions of Bruce Wayne. If they were in the same comic book, that would be a little weird. Although there is one great comic, I can't remember now exactly. It's Planetary is a different comic series, but they did one where they go and see Batman, and he's getting shot by these like alternative rays or something. And so he goes from 66 Batman, like Adam West, into Dark Knight Batman, like Frank Miller's grunge hardcore guy or whatever, and back and forth. And it's really jarring, but it also makes you think like, yeah, those are all Batman, and we all recognize them as Batman. And so there's room, and that's one of the reasons why it's interesting, to move from one thing to another. And also to answer Bella's question about why I would choose Batman, I could choose Superman or someone. But when you think about verging on 100 years, you can go from 1939 for Batman and see various changes. And that's one of the things I do in the book. Same with the Joker. They contrast each other perfectly. I don't think it would be the same with Lex and Superman or something. But more so now, there's been talk about how maybe the Joker is in a relationship or has some kind of relationship. There's always been an idea that the Joker at least wants a relationship with Batman, a sexual one. But they are both kind of the same coin, flipped side, one and the other, right? One acts like a traditional heteronormative person, Bruce Wayne, right? One totally doesn't. It looks like he's wearing lipstick and makeup and he's sort of flamboyant. But they both, what I argue is like, pay very close attention to the tropes of like what makes a man in the 50s, in the 70s, and so on. And then the Joker says, yeah, I'm not going to do that, and makes fun of the people that do. Bruce Wayne says, in fact, he literally says in one of the early comics to Dick, Robin, he says like, pay attention to what these guys are doing. you're going to need to like act like this, right? So pay close attention to the norms. But we see those norms change over time. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Batman and the Joker and that dynamic, is that they highlight what it meant to be a man and straight or gay in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And we could get into details and nuances, but they reflect that. They also, like with Damned, the image of the bat penis that you guys probably all Googled when I was talking about it, that kind of pushes the envelope a little bit, but also reflects a more open society, as you were saying.
I just want to respond to this. Yes, absolutely. It is difficult. I wish I could convey to you all, I wish I had the words to convey how powerful Stan Lee's revolution in the 60s was. Silver Age comics, if you read them, Superman is the same as Aquaman, is the same as Batman. They're pretty much the same character. Everything is idealized, stylized, very formulaic. Of course, that's what I was reading, and that's what I grew up on. When Spider-Man came out, Fantastic Four, real people, real problems. I remember it hit me so hard to see I think it was a Thor comic, I actually looked it up one time, an actual picture of an actual car. Not this sort of stylized four-wheel vehicle, but an actual car you could look outside and see. They were New York City, not Gotham or Metropolis. Yes, absolutely. And that, of course, was a part of the zeitgeist of the era, the 60s, when so much change and questioning was going on. Here again, I would encourage you to follow up if any of you are interested. The collection upstairs you can track. This is why it's so valuable to have a collection, not just a single, the Spider-Man 50, which is up there, Wolverine's first appearance, which is up there, but what happened before, what happened after, in all of the sequential art and stories before and after. That's the story. That's the story, the answer to your question.
Raise the question, would it be less interesting if the author ever said Batman is gay or Batman, Yeah. And it's interesting because it makes me think about how, like, the different roles that queer readings have had to play, and queer coding of characters have had to play over time, where, nowadays we have openly LGBTQIA plus heroes and characters, but we didn't for a long time. And, perhaps, I don't know, I'm kind of thinking out loud a little bit, but because it didn't have to say Batman was gay, because everybody assumed he was straight, because that was presumed by default, and queer coding or queer reading was sort of the crumbs left over to, gay kids who were like, maybe, just maybe. And so for a while, the role of kind of queer coding or queer readings was leaving room for hope and optimism. But then I also think about how big a deal it was for many of us when, like, Iceman, Bobby Drake, was actually confirmed to be gay, and when that was canon, that was a big deal, because it was no longer like queer baiting, it was no longer like teasing us about a character, but it was like confirmed, hey, he's one of us.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like, at what point does that become the crumbs that we just have to kind of be happy with?
Yeah.
Versus like the value of that explicit representation.
Yeah, so I would like to answer your question, and Dr. Josh, who I'm assuming is Josh Guitar, but maybe not. Maybe you can confirm or deny that online, because the handle is Dr. Josh. But so you're asking about whether or not, or the role of representation and out characters and explicitly LGBTQIA people, right? Yes, it's Josh Guitar. So the role of how that works and whether how to make sense of it, right? Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and just how it's, I guess it's also sort of a question or reasoning. Is the idea of saying it's less interesting to say a character is gay, is that maybe almost a privileged perspective versus somebody who has had to be like, oh my gosh, finally we have a gay.
Yeah. Well, and that actually goes back to the earlier question about the role of comics or comics as a form, right? Because if we were to talk about race, and if we were to talk about more visual media like comics or especially film, right? You either sort of have a black character or you don't. I mean, you have an actor perhaps who identifies as black and he's black on the screen then, right? And you can say this is a representation of at least one African American, and that's an important moment. If there are 0 and it goes to 1, that's a big flip, right? Or a big change, big moment in representation. You know, you don't see necessarily gay or straight, right? Visually. And so I think, yes, it's a privilege sort of to say that, you know, it's not so interesting if Batman were gay or if he came out as gay. And yeah, I definitely see how you could read it like that. But I also want to point out or just make clear that I don't think Batman ever has to say I'm straight, as you said, but he also isn't necessarily straight. And that's one of those readings that, yes, for a long time, like in the queer theory world, right, of all the different, there's some great books out there about queer readings and about how to interpret, and as you said, sort of pick the crumbs of what's left in interpretation to be like, oh, maybe that's a queer reference or something, right? But I think, yeah, we all often assume that, well, Batman's straight because he's never come out as gay and he's never said I'm gay, so he must be straight. But that's not necessarily true at all, right? I mean, it could very easily be, and I understand there's a power dynamic at play, but it could very easily be that Batman's always been gay, he always will be gay, and he's just never said it, right? And so it would equally be, to me, boring if he came out and said, hey, everybody, I'm definitely straight. But because there's all these room for double entendres and things, you could always say, like, Batman just said he's straight. That's totally gay. Right? Like, you could do a different, even if he explicitly does something, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's underneath, right? There's always these layers and performances. And so Dr. Josh asked about a possibility of a psychoanalytic reading. And one thing I do in the book is I talk about Jacques Lacan, who came after Freud and who has this idea of le désir de l'homme, c'est le désir d'autre. And that's the man's desire is a desire of the other, which can be interpreted in different ways. But the way I like to think of it is that, yes, you can desire another person, or another someone else, but you can also desire what that other person desires. And so I think of it more like that with Batman, at least the representations. So Bruce Wayne or Batman sees other people, men getting married to women and stuff like that, right? These norms. And he kind of says, like, to himself, oh, well, I better get married to a woman too, right? And so he starts showing people how he desires what other people desire, but it always fails and backfires. And then he always thinks to himself, like, I definitely don't want to be married. And so he's sort of gotten married, but never does really. And there's always this play where he's like, yeah, sure, I'll be your fiance. But then at the end of the episode or whatever, he's just so happy to be back in the Batcave. And so there's this idea of us, I argue that to a more or less extent, we all do this, right? We see what other people want, and then we're like, yeah, that's what I want. And it seems natural, which is not to say that there's no, you know, I don't want to get into a biological argument or anything like that, but there's definitely a case in our culture where we see people wanting stuff, and then we act like we want that stuff. And you very clearly, I think if you look for it, see Bruce Wayne looking around and being like, all these men are saying I should get a girlfriend and get a fiance. Well, I have a fiance now. And, you know, he's all happy to show people that, but he doesn't seem to be interested in any way. And I think that's a sort of psychoanalytic reading that you can do even when they're not necessarily putting that in there themselves. You can see, like, a dissatisfaction with all of these attempts to be a man. And he represents that really well. But I think there's probably room to do it in other places as well. You want to add more to it?
Your question is very interesting. I would suggest another kind of corollary to that is think of Peter Lorre, for example. He was a very effeminate character, like in The Maltese Falcon. Some of you may have to look at that. Very effeminate character, very clearly gay. In fact, Sam Spade, when he left, sniffed the air and said, lavender. He was a bad guy. Gay characters who were portrayed as gay without saying they're gay, they were the bad guys. you know, the effeminate Nazi, um, uh, all through, well, popular culture. For so many years, if the character was identified as gay, oh, that's a bad guy. Same thing with the transgender person. Um, uh, the character in uh, Silence of the Lambs, the movie with Michael Caine, what was it? Dressed to Kill. The transgender, oh, a man in a dress, killer. Yeah, yeah, man in a dress. He's got an axe in his purse, and he's going to kill you in some horrible way. So what I think that for gay kids growing up and reading books, watching movies, I think that had to be very disturbing. I know it was for me growing up. Whenever I saw a transgender character, for whatever reason, they were either so silly as to just be, you know, for comedy, or they were the killer. Now we're sort of seeing that change. I'm thinking the character in Dallas Buyers Club. Now we're seeing the transgender with the heart of gold. So where is that change? And I think that can also be an interesting question to look into. Did you? Yeah.
Do you want to summarize for a second?
Um,
If you can. It's a good question.
yeah, asking if the characters like Jerry Siegel, Bob Kane, way back when, if they portrayed the characters deliberately as very straight, heteronormative people out of fear of rejection. I mean, would they be published? And the answer is no. I mean, I don't think there's.
No, they wouldn't be published.
They would not be published. No, they unless of course they present like the Joker, very feminine, lipstick. Oh, that's the bad guy. That's the killer. I wrote a paper many, many years ago when I was in college and talking about comics. And I said this, and I've always liked this. I came up with comics are always a magic mirror of the world at the time. In other words, there are buildings, there are people, there are cars, airplanes. There's a recognizable environment, but we have these super powered people in them. So comics have overt, heroic, homosexual or transgender people. Times are changing. And it's still a magic mirror. I mean, you're not going to go out and look up and see Superman, but there's the effort to make it more. I think there's always the effort to embed the comics in the reality and the expectations, gender and gender, political, whatever, of the times.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about Bob Kane and Bill Finger. So I'm sure anyone who knows about Batman knows sort of that Bob Kane created Batman, or at least that was the idea for a very long time. And he was a very sort of, when you look at representations, I mean, I never knew him personally, obviously, but he seemed to be a very sort of heteronormative, kind of hegemonic masculinity type of guy, right? Very loud, very much seeking the spotlight. Bill Finger, who ended up having a gay son, was the co-creator, but didn't have any representation really until more recently. And it's an interesting just story. So you can get all into it, but basically the idea was if he had a gay son, there wouldn't be any kids, and because the son died, I believe, of AIDS, he wouldn't have, no one would be entitled, and therefore nobody would represent Bill Finger's work. But it turned out he did have a kid, or Bill Finger had a granddaughter, and so that's, I mean, there's a big thing, and it's a good little documentary. I think it's on Hulu right now. But the whole idea of giving that person, who seemed to be more quiet, maybe more feminine. It's hard to say exactly what Bill Finger was like because he was so much sort of pushed to the side with this big flamboyant Bob Kane in the center. But I think that's a good indication of like Bill Finger might have put in some stuff there that could be read more queerly. But Bob Kane quickly took center stage and he didn't seem to want any of that, right? And there's just all this dynamic that would be interesting to think about. I think today even places like Disney, there's some good places, some good readings I've seen lately, and I'm gonna get to a question about readings. But basically, even Disney knows that to get as many people as it needs or wants, it needs to have queer potential, like queer reading potential, but never so much so that the heteronormative, homophobic perhaps people don't purchase your stuff, right? And so that's something that most popular things, including DC today, do is they put in enough that if queer readers or people who want to read queerly, and that's a whole other definitional thing, but they can get something out of it, but so can homophobic people. And that's another issue with today's ideology, right? Today's ideology in popular culture kind of implicitly says it's fine if you're homophobic, here, have Superman, but also if you're gay, here, have Superman. We'll make sure that there's enough in there that you can get something out of it. And that's one of the reasons they will never say Superman is 100% definitely straight or gay or anything like that, because they want it to be polysemic, I would say. And just to answer Michaela's great question about is there any readings you would recommend, what does it mean to read queerly? That's another thing. But in terms of readings, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed Alexander Doughty. I think it's Doughty or Doughty. His work on, what is it called? There's two books, Making Things Perfectly Queer and Flaming Classics. Both are really great. But also there's a book that's pretty famous, at least in queer theory, by Jose Esteban Munoz called Cruising Utopia, The Then and There of Queer Futurity. And I want to thank Dr. Frank, who put me onto this book earlier. But if you'll indulge me, I just want to read, this is what I do in the book, is I quote Munoz's Queer Futurity, and then I ask what it would mean if Batman were in there. And so his quote is how he begins this book. Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine the future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. And so, yeah, I definitely recommend that as a book. And just to play with this a little bit, I'll just switch queer with Batman and think about what this kind of reveals. And I'm in no way saying that Batman is the equivalent or equal to queerness or anything, but just think about the potential that Batman gives us in a similar way, especially if we were to do a queer reading of him. Batman is not yet here. Batman is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet Batman. We may never touch Batman, but we can feel him as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been Batman, yet Batman exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine the future. The future is Batman's domain. Batman is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. And like I said, this is no way meant to belittle the struggles and progress of queer activists and queer people, but it is, I think, telling that we can place Batman and queerness in a similar place in terms of how we see and how we use it, and it can work to illuminate sort of where we are positionally and how we can understand those things. So thank you, Michaela Online. Question? Did I see a question earlier? I thought I saw a hand up. Yeah? Sorry.
Something that just kind of thinking about the Damned book, Penis book.
The Penis book, yeah. Damned. There is a three-issue book story.
Which I didn't know what it was called, but I remember when that took over the internet. So
Yeah.
when you referenced that, I was like, oh, I know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because something else that kind of arose in my mind and thinking about the contrast of the evolution of Batman over time, the sort of, are Batman and Robin gay, kind of in ambiguously gay duo SNL kind of tropism. And then I just can't help but thinking kind of about the shift of Frank Miller.
Yeah.
And The Dark Knight Returns. And I remember watching at some formative age an interview with Frank Miller talking about that work and how specifically his goal for that was that was when Batman should get his balls back. And that was specifically the phrasing that he used. And I just think that, I don't know, I'm kind of curious about kind of the reaction to that and maybe what, also thinking of kind of the contrast between DC as like sort of the golden age, we're an aspirational society versus now when you think of DC, it's the grunge, the dark, the sort of, everything that's worst about humanity in many ways. And then, kind of when you were talking about the revolution of Stan Lee, it was grounded in reality. And even now, there's humor, but a grounding in reality for Marvel versus DC. So, a couple.
Yeah. Well, so to follow up on the idea of like Batman 66 and the sort of definitely the campiest Batman of all. Although Schumacher's later Batman and Robin, I don't want to get into, but we could get into. Yeah. But no, I mean, so a lot of people who want that strong heteronormative macho guy who in the 80s was coming out as a macho guy when Schwarzenegger and Stallone and all of these major muscular heroes were Rambo and Terminator and stuff. Miller comes out with The Dark Knight and people really gravitated towards that. He never would have done that, I think. He never would have been so adamant, like he needs to get his balls back, right? I don't remember I'm sure I must have seen that, but anyway, I'm trusting you that he said exactly that. Yeah. I know he talks about the Joker as a gay nightmare, a queer nightmare, a homophobic nightmare, he calls it, I think. But so he's very adamant that, Batman needs his balls back. But that's because this perception that Batman lost his balls when he was portrayed in that 60s show, right? And so in a sense, the Dark Knight Batman is a product of a camp Batman, which the Dark Knight creators and lovers of that Batman probably would not be too happy to admit. But if the Batman show didn't come out, Batman was sinking in sales, comics, right? If that show didn't pick it up again, we probably would have lost Batman, at least the way that the continuity went. And so Camp Batman saved Batman, even though most people, especially people who are behind the Frank Miller style, hate that Batman, right? And I make a similar argument in the book about how we would think that there's a lot of misperceptions, I guess, in our current ideology, which is that sort of like, just what came first, right? And in fact, most of the descriptions of heterosexuality came after the invention of homosexuality as a psychological term. Most of the things that Batman does that make him super straight come after the Joker questions his manlyhood. And most of the criminal things about homosexuals, about like what a straight couple should be in a straight family, came after other representations or other mental diseases and stuff like that people started to say, this is what it means to be homosexual, so we have to do the opposite, that's heterosexual. So heterosexuality was actually born out of homosexuality, really. I mean, I think you could make the argument. In a similar way, this dark, brooding Batman was born out of camp Batman. And so there is an interesting dynamic that the Joker and the Batman help to highlight, right? Like you could easily say, and they do in the comics, Batman came out of the Joker, right? The Joker's lavender flamboyance created this stiff guy, but this stiff guy also is what makes the Joker have fun and become the Joker, right? So they make each other in a similar, more allegorical way of the way that homosexuality and heterosexuality have made each other, even though especially the heterosexual norm always wants to point to the homosexuals as an abomination or as a different bad thing. Like they come from that, right? Like their whole identity comes from that. And so I see Batman as a microcosm in respect to that. You want to say?
Yeah, I think this comes back to the kind of the point of the slide is this whole transgender. Like I said, transgender isn't just putting on clothes. I mean, there's things change, but there's kind of a, at least in the old days, there's sort of the spectrum of, it's sort of a fetishistic thing. You put on an item of clothing and sexual release, all the way to people who have the full, living full time and have the surgery. But in all of those cases, it's always the desire to achieve the heteronormative aspect. The comics, I always said for years that comic books shaped my character. And I was always thinking in terms of honor, integrity, do the right thing. You know, I was growing up a big kid. With great power comes great responsibility, that whole thing. But in these discussions that we've had, that Chris and I have had, I'm starting to think, I wonder if part of the appeal to me personally, and perhaps many other transgender and gay kids as well, is the comic books were teaching me how to be that man that I needed to be in order to survive in the world of the 50s, 60s, well, up until very recently. I don't know, when the shift happened, but the shift is very real. I know that if I had transitioned, I'll go back to 20 years, it would have been very, very difficult. Now, like when I called my doctor and I said, I have to tell you, I'm transgender. I would prefer my preferred name to be Diana. And the response was, oh, I'm so proud of you. That's wonderful. Just like it's difficult to put into words the shift that Stan Lee brought about, for those of us growing up, born in the 50s and so forth, to embrace this change, it is world changing. It was the rule, never tell, never, ever tell. I told a few people, I told my spouse, very few people, didn't tell my kids, didn't tell anybody. But now things are different. So it's being transgendered, but of course it's, well, all the letters, LGBT, all those letters. But this whole thing about the superhero as transgender, because they're Batman of the 80s, Frank Miller's Batman, had to perform as that kind of expectation that the Schwarzeneggers and so forth had, I'm making this up, had kind of made the expectation. Adam West performed to the expectation that the world expected at the time, very campy and so forth. Like I said, it's a magic mirror. It's a magic mirror. But this whole thing about transgender, if you think of transgender as being, sometimes people have said, oh, you must be happy to be your true self. And I correct them. I say, no, I've always been a true self. That person who was a husband and a father and all the rest, that was a true self. This is a true self. And I think that's what to me is the most compelling thing about this with the comics, is that, and maybe that's what appealed to me as a kid, that I saw Bruce Wayne, Clark Kent being weak and so forth, and then he's Superman, and I thought, gosh, I feel like Clark Kent inside, but on the outside, I have to be Superman. I'm really looking forward to exploring this whole idea, because I think there's depth to it, and even in this discussion, and thank you, I'm seeing even more.
Maybe this will be the last question. Are there others?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to give an opportunity, so if anyone has something online, they can. We have 2 questions here that we'll take. Thank you.
What do you see for the future of comics, the future of superheroes, now that people are becoming aware of this queer coding of villains and this kind of the crumbs that we're left with when it comes to questioning our main protagonist's gender, sexuality, so on and so forth? Do you see this changing anytime soon with the way that our society is being more open to these concepts, or is it just going to be like how it's been, kind of maybe not, just for the sake of not offending anybody?
I think Chris probably has more to say about this, but
Just summarize
Uh,
it.
oh, I'm sorry. The question was, how will comic books change? Have they finally explored everything that can be explored? Have they finally gone from the heights of banality to the depths of grittiness, and everything in between? Or will they continue to change and, if I read you, be a viable medium?
Yeah.
I think yes, because the one thing comics have done since 1938 successfully is to be this magic mirror. So whatever the world becomes, I think comic books will be the magic mirror. So it'll be kind of this recursive thing. The magic mirror looks interesting, so we buy the books, so they become more interesting, back and forth. So I think yes. What that looks like, who knows? Whatever the world looks like, it's going to be part of that world, sort of.
Yeah, in terms of making it mainstream or not, or what can people do, I definitely think it'll continue to move with the sort of cultural ideologies in general. I mean, there are some great comics about people coming out or about gay characters, specifically, explicitly gay characters, and other people within the sort of rainbow, right? Of all of the ways that you can represent it, probably at this point, there are all of those representations available to us, although obviously not so much in the mainstream. Like Batman is very mainstream, but one of the reasons I kind of like it, the Batman mythos, and to explore it is because yes, there's a long history of it, and which will continue, and there's also these layers now that people understand better and better. So I think Batman's very intimidating to get into, and I started reading, like, I always knew about him. I liked the Michael Keaton one and all of this, right, when I was little, but I started reading it during my PhD when I wanted to break from all the theory stuff, right? And you can kind of see that now I've just put it together, so I don't know how badly I fucked things up, but I used to have like theory and then comics were like a little escape. Yeah, and now I've put it together, and so I'm sorry.
The book is very good.
I try to make it accessible, but yeah, I definitely was in the back of my mind had these theories still going when I was reading Batman. But there's so much that I was just like, I don't know who the hell that is. I don't know who this is. But there's 5 Batmans now, like who? And this isn't even Bruce Wayne. This is Dick being Batman, and like all this stuff, right? So it gets very complicated. But that's also the strength of a big character like Batman, is that there's all this room for play that you don't get in a sort of indie comic, which is it's a good thing in a different way, right? So an indie comic that has like a coming out story, cool, that's something that it does. With Batman, you have 50 layers that people are thinking about. So on one layer, it's like, can an 8-year-old enjoy this? Hopefully, depending, not the Black Label ones maybe, but the regular Batman, an 8-year-old boy or girl should be able to enjoy it. But also, a 50-year-old scholar should hopefully be able to enjoy it too, and see like, oh, they're referencing this, or they're playing with this notion that came earlier in Batman mythos and stuff. And so with that, it makes it very hard to do like, this is the explicit tale, unless you do something like, it was just a dream in the end, he came out but it was a dream or something. I could see that kind of thing. Yeah. But you also have this you have a retconning, and you have these abilities to like say, yeah, he killed somebody, but he never kills, right? Or he's celibate, but he did do this one thing and had a baby, and all of these different elements can come together in this weird way. But that also means that it's going to be a different story than, like I said, like a more indie comic where you can just get more explicit. This idea that that the person, and as far as I can tell, it's a legit petition, wanted DC to admit, or to kind of just come out and say the Joker is gay, as opposed to all of this hinting, because that would be sort of empowering. And I could sort of see that argument, but I also see the argument that having Batman and the Joker both not really come out, but also not necessarily be straight, is also empowering in the sense that it leaves open a queer reading. And just answer an earlier question online, there are a bunch of ways to define it, but to me, I would just say a queer reading embraces the idea of looking at norms and expectations, but not necessarily espousing them. In other words, you understand what it means to be a man in a certain cultural context at a certain period, but you also understand the ways that you can play with that. And so it's a very sort of open reading, as opposed to a very clear, like, Batman's straight, of course he's straight, we don't need to talk about this anymore, right? If you have a conversation with an 8-year-old boy who's just watched a show or something, you try to say like, hey, do you think Batman might be gay? That's when you get like, no, he's straight, you saw his girlfriend, she's pretty, this is how the world works, right? Yeah, which is why a lot of those people who don't want to have that conversation, they hate Joel Schumacher, they hate the 60s Batman, they love The Dark Knight because Frank Miller gets rid of all that gay stuff or whatever, or the bad guys are the ones that are either transsexual or gay or queer in whatever way, right? And so it goes back to that like easy time when like everything is like on one side or the other. I'd say, yeah, like a queer reading allows you to play with that, but by definition, you can't necessarily fix things. They can't be fixed. And so, yeah, I don't think Batman could ever fix himself either as straight or gay or anything else. But that's part of the joy of it too, I would say. Yes.
Okay, that made me think of something that maybe this will help, like, give everyone something to read if y'all haven't read this. We're talking about, this is my question.
Okay.
Like, giving everybody something to read that is like a very modern, very popular, and extremely well-selling, like, thing that hits on all those is Saga. That's pretty good, right? Have you read Saga?
No, I've read like the first volume of Saga, but I haven't gone through it.
Okay, so if you go super into it, they get very more like deep.
Am I gonna have to spend like 20 years of my life trying to understand it like Batman? No? Okay.
It's a very well.
So Saga is compressed.
And it's very well. It's not that. It's
Okay, I thought it was.
It's supposed to be done. And here's so. It's supposed to be done a while ago, but the fan demand. Yeah, the fan demand for it was so big that they continued the story and doing it.
Yeah, it's Brian K. Vaughan, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Brian K. Vaughan. Because yeah, I liked Why the Last Man
The
too.
more you go into it, so it's so funny because Saga blew up right before the Batman happened.
Saga blew up before Batman's body blew up the internet.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's so funny because people had such a bad reaction to the Batman showing that, but Saga became so popular. It was,
Actually, there was a penis in Why the Last Man too.
there's
Yeah.
There's penises in Saga.
and so Saga, there is everything. In Saga.
There's everything.
Okay.
There's everything in Saga, and it's so funny because people embrace that one so hard, but then we're so against the Batman like one panel when like almost every panel in Saga has something like that in it. It's like just very weird.
Yeah.
But if you go deeper into Saga 2, they start representing different types of sexualities a lot more. And those volumes are actually some of the more popular volumes for those books. And they end up having a character who is the main character. Her name is Petrichor, and she is a transgender character, and she's a main character. And they actually have full shots and are explaining. She is explaining to a child in this comic book, a like 5-year-old child, what being transgender is and means to her. And I think that was such a big moment for comic book because in the panel she is naked, like, and they clearly she is some surgeries but not all surgeries. So she's, and that's where the child comes up to ask. She has full female breasts, but on the lower part of the panel she still has like a penis. And so for this book, I think that's
Can I comment on that?
But just summarize too.
Yeah,
Try to summarize.
Dakota was talking about, and again, I am so far out. I stopped reading the comics early 2000s, I think. So this is the first I've heard of this. Okay, so I assume that Saga is a series, not DC or Marvel. Yeah. Okay. But when Dakota said that there's a main transgender character, a hero,
very walk the line between hero and villain, but on the
Like
on
a-
the whole, it's more.
like a Catwoman type character, maybe. Okay. See, I have to relate this to what I. But Dakota said something that the character was explaining to a 5-year-old what it means to be a transgender. I have to share this with you. When I shared, as I told you, I never told my kids, but when I came out, transition, obviously, I told them. They would say, "Okay, fine." Different world, 20 years ago. But then we had the conversation with my grandkids. And my daughter said, Zoe, my little girl, she was, my little grandchild was 6 years old, I think. Do you know what transgender is? And she gave a textbook perfect description of transgender that clearly she had learned in school, because where else could it was like literally out of a textbook. A transgender person is, and I was, oh. So coming back to what you're asking, will comic books survive with this kind of thing? Again, reflecting the world as it's changing, despite what some of our political leaders want. I had to share that because there's a scene in comics which I have reflected in real life, and there's your answer, I think.
Yes.
I think that's your answer, isn't it? Yeah. It was a very telling moment.
I did. Go for it. I know they couldn't really show it or say it back then, but like that you read is more this character that I'm looking at, I relate to a lot because I see their experience being similar to mine, as close to being as transgender at that point as they could. Was there like a character that was in, and do you think one of those fit that experience close enough where if they were to be reintroduced today as brand new, that's like say Wonder Woman, they kind of like she never happened. Do you think she could today be introduced as transgender, like whatever character you had?
Yeah.
Like,
Dakota's question was, growing up, 56 and so forth, was there a character that I identified as, oh, that person could be transgender? Again, I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for the community. I can't even speak for the senior transgender community. And I have to say no. And boy, that's a good question, because now I have to think about it. Like I said, there's so much that's just come out of this discussion. And Dakota, I think it was because, like I said, the books were teaching me what it meant to be the man, not only that I wanted to be, but that I needed to be. So I kind of took their depictions at face value. I wasn't looking for the spaces between the panels. I wasn't looking for any undercurrents as such. Boy, that's a good question. I think the only thing I could say is that, oh, it's possible to be Clark Kent and then to put on these different clothes and become somebody different, somebody who's empowered to do other things. And maybe that's why the books were so important to me. But I honestly can't say. Boy, that's a good question, though. But your other question was, could some of those classic characters, if they had not been invented, could they be reintroduced as a trans character? Like well, of course, I identify with Wonder Woman a lot. And by the way, talk about costumes in movies, Gal Gadot's costume was so good. So good. Never didn't care for Henry Cavill's Superman. Looked like blue bubble wrap, but anyway, that's kind of one of those what if questions. Boy, some good writers and artists should take a hold of that and reintroduce these mainline characters. Boy, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Thank you for that. Thank you for making me think about that. That's a really good place to stop.
Yeah, no, I want to thank Prism for putting this on and helping a recording of the live one without the crap that happened in between. But thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Diana for donating your comics and for coming here to speak. And just as a reminder, she'll be here tomorrow too. If you want to have a one-on-one chat with her or come and see some of the comics that are available, she'll be at the library. But thank you all very much, and thank you online.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for your questions. It has really been illuminating. Thank you so much.